All right, in this video, we're going to take a look at how to process an image using most of the controls in the Adjust tool tab. So we'll start with an image. Let's start with this one. So this one has some obvious mistakes, and I might have shown you guys this one when I was processing in Lightroom, but this one I will now process here in Capture One. So let's take a look at what we need to do here. So first off, when you normally work in here, you could argue that you could crop first, but this one, because I'm going to do some adjustments on the uprights and stuff like that, we'll start there. But the exposure is bugging me, so let's fix that first. So first I'm just going to go ahead and pull down the exposure so I can kind of see what the image looks like. Leave it there for now, come back, do some fine tuning after I do some adjustments with the shape. So we'll go to the shape tool, and in here we can go in and we can do lens corrections. They're not as robust with the options of lens corrections in here as you would find in Lightroom. Adobe spends a lot of time really trying to get those down. And in Capture One, it comes down to there's a lot less choices. There are decent choices, but when you go into them and you start looking at the lists, you'll find that it's definitely a lot less stuff. So for example, this shot was shot with an old manual focus 28mm lens. It's actually a 28 2.8, so it's actually kind of on the slower side. Actually, it might even be a 3.5. I sold it a few years back, so I can't remember for sure. So basically, I'd have to go in here and say, okay, I got to find a 28, and I'm just going to go ahead and say, okay, I'll use the 28 1.8G because that's close, and that will hopefully correct the curvature of what a 28 would do. Now, you'll notice on this list here, it's a lot of the autofocus lenses from Nikon, but there really are none of the older school manual focus lenses, which Adobe has spent some time getting in and adjusting. So we'll go ahead and click that, and it adjusted it just a smidge. And then once I do lens corrections, I can just close that panel up. Purple fringe, I'll come back to that later on. The cropping, it'll get adjusted by other things. So the keystoning is the key thing in this shot that needs to be adjusted. And I could click auto and let it do it, but I'm going to go ahead and click the vertical uprights because that's really all I'm going to adjust in this shot, because there's just a little bit of keystoning that I think I could fix by using this tool. So I'll click that, and it gives me the ability to basically go in and draw lines. And you'll notice that there's an overlay that shows up, and then you can adjust the overlay based on the angle of what you want to correct. So I'll go this way a little bit here, and on this one, I'm going to go ahead and it's going to look weird for a half second. Get the keystone on that one there. So I'm basically adjusting this line here and this line here. So once I get the sliders to where I want them, I'm still fine tuning this because I really don't like exactly where I put it a minute ago. So once I get it to where I want it to be, and I can choose all kinds of different lines. I could use the telephone pole. I'm using the building. I could use the more extreme parts of the building over here. So let's go ahead and put that over here. So I'll run it along the line here. And I'm eyeballing it the best I can. It doesn't have to be an exact science unless it needs to be, but there we go. And you'll notice there's this giant apply button right here in the middle. So that's actually how you apply what you've done. And when you do that, you'll notice it goes in and it kind of pre-crops the image based on what you've done. And you can fix that crop later. So right now it's cropping like this, which is okay because I'd already kind of cropped it when I shot it off the top there. It's working for what I want, and I'll go ahead and just hit enter, and it's done. So now I can go ahead and move on to other things. Now you'll notice when you crop, a lot of the times it shows the crop overlay like this, so you can see how it's been cropped. So now we're going to go over to adjust, and I'm going to go ahead and change the tool back to the regular selection tool, which gets rid of that overlay. So the keystone can also be chosen from up here. So I didn't necessarily have to go to shape to get to that. I could just go up to the tooltip, the cursor tools up here, grab one, and just say adjust that. And then if I wanted to fix the crop that it did, I could click here where the crop tool is, and I could say, okay, give me a little bit more of that telephone pole if you can. It may or may not be able to based on what it did. And right now it seems to be locked into a certain dimension size. So I'd go in here and say, let's give it unconstrained. And now when I go back in, I can go and adjust this over this way a little bit. I can't go any more over here unless I drop down from the sky, but I'm okay with the way this kind of looks right now, so we're good to go. And now we'll go ahead and go back to the regular selection tool, and then the crop overlay is gone. So let's go ahead and start with the white balance. So I always tend to shoot with my camera, usually in daylight white balance, because I like to see what the color of the actual light is actually doing. So if I'm shooting an open shade, it's blue. If I'm shooting in late afternoon golden hour, it's yellow, that type of thing. And then when I bring it in here, it'll always say as shot, and then I'll go in and adjust it however I feel I need to. So for example, in this one, I'm going to go ahead and just click right onto sunny, and that takes us up to 5129, which is their interpretation of sunny, which is based on like the average kind of like sky, and I don't like that. The colors just are not looking that great. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the magenta that it took away. I'm going to bring it back, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this back up to around 55, or if I want to, I can just type in 5500. And if I feel that that's not right, I can go in then and look at the shot and see if I have something that's gray in here, and use the eyedropper and try to do that. But this shot doesn't have a lot of gray. If I try to do the concrete, it probably will shift it really weird. So we'll click the concrete, and yeah, it took it somewhere that it definitely isn't. So this just comes down to playing around and tinkering and sliding the slider around till you get it to where you think it should be. If I kick it up to the 6,000, the start gets to, you know. So, and this shot also, like I said before, it was a little bit overexposed, so this could be affecting the appearance of the color balance, because there could be information missing because it was overexposed. All right, so we already pulled down the exposure down to like -2 stops, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it at minus like 1.3 or whatever. Let's see, where was I before? 1.55. We'll leave it there. I'm going to jump into the high dynamic range, and I'm going to do my general, like pull the blacks over and pull the whites up, which you'll notice is affecting the way the histogram's going. And since the histogram is on the overexposed side, it's definitely a lot of information over on this side. So once again, I can pull the exposure over, and that'll move mostly everything over to the center. And you can see now that the adjustment of the black and the white that I did has definitely applied here. If I was to go in and undo these, you can see that it's a little bit muddier. So I like to keep it where it was. And then I'll pull down the highlights if I feel that they're too washed out. And in this case, I'm okay with that. The clarity tool works similar to the clarity tool in Lightroom, where I can go in and now slide this one direction or the other. If I kick it up a little bit, it does tend to spread apart the midtones as opposed to spreading apart all the way across, which is what the contrast slider will evenly pull all the way across. Whereas the clarity slider, it pulls the midtones apart, and that, to me, is, I think, a stronger way to apply that tool. So now the image is starting to look a lot stronger. Because it's now more corrected, I can go back now in here and take a look at what the white balance is doing. I could now maybe take it more towards the cooler side. And if I felt I needed to dehaze, I could. This shot may or may not have a lot of dehaze in it, so I might just leave it alone. And so that's this image. Another quick processing, let's take a look at another image. This one too also has a lot of issues with the keystoning. So once again, I would start my processing by grabbing the, going up to the keystone vertical up here under the cursor tools, and I would go ahead and move these based on, I'm going to move this one based on the building there, and I'm going to do this one based on the building over here, which means I'll be doing probably along this line here. And once I'm happy with that, I'll click apply, and boom, it pulls the image into a more normal look. Even the gentleman stopped being so curved, which I think is important to see with what I did with this image. Also, by doing this, I cropped really tight to this building, which is great. But I feel that now I still need to do a little bit more on that building, so I'm going to go ahead and click apply and see what that does, and that rotated that building just a little bit more. I will go to the crop tool, and once again I'll do a right click and make sure that I turn off the ratio of original, which is the 2:3. And in this instance now I'll go ahead and pull this up to include the top of that building. And it's looking pretty clean. I've got some breathing room here on that side, and I'm cropped right at the edge of this building here, so it looks really nice. And then once I do that, let's go back into the crop tool again. I want to make sure I keep that gentleman in. So yeah, since I'm losing my gentleman there, I need to figure out where I can lose from. So I'm going to go ahead and lose from this side so that I can, no, I got to lose a little bit from this side too. So it looks like I'm going to lose a little bit of that building. Just pull this down just a touch. Now I've got him there. It's not as good as I would want. I actually might consider doing more on the building. So it's where you get finite. You can go down rabbit holes here, guys. You can just, oh, I'm just going to keep tinkering, keep tinkering. If I feel that I don't need this building as much, make it more about the scene. I can do something along here. Bring it down, bring him back in. Boom. There we go. Looking good. All right. So once again, this one, the white balance was assigned automatically by the automatic white balance. I could go in here and see if there's a gray area. I could hover above here and see what that does. Doesn't change it much at all. So I will go in maybe into what daylight looks like. And it kicks it to 52, which is a little touch better than it was. So I'm going to leave it there. Once again, the exposure is pretty spot on. So now all I would do here is once again pull my blacks over a little bit, pull up my whites just a touch, just a hint of clarity in there just to spread out those tones, flatten them a little down a little bit from the spikes in the center, which isn't really flattening them, it's just pulling them down. And then I can go ahead and maybe a hint, no, just a hint of dehaze. Now you'll notice that as you are processing in here, this does a lot more nuanced processing. It's not as heavy-handed as Lightroom is. It seems to be more nuanced, which means it doesn't go as far, but it definitely does more of a wider range as it does work on the lower end of its adjustments. So that pretty much gets me to where I like this image, and it's pretty much ready to go. At this point, I would go in and consider doing some other things with, so if I go into the color panel here, I can start jumping into different options in here and adjust some colors based on what's going on. So for example, I could go into the highlights, and on the highlights alone, I could kind of shift them towards the cool side. Which will darken my, give my sky a little bit more blue, cool the area image off a little bit, but only in the highlights. So that's basically what I could do through there. Normalize is a deep thing. We'll talk more about that later on. And then I could also go into back to adjust, and I could go into layers, and I can go in here and choose to apply maybe a graduated filter, which allows me to drag from the top down. Creates a gradient just like you saw inside of Lightroom when it does it. This actually does it more like the older versions of Lightroom. With that there, then I can go in. It gives you basically, once you do that, these adjustment tools are the exact same ones you saw before, but they're only being applied to this layer. So basically, I'm going to go in here now and pull down the exposure there. And I'm getting a graduated down. Downside is it's also affecting the building, so I'd have to go in like we did before and do some erasing on it. Let's create a new mask. New brush. And now we'll go ahead, and wherever the plus is selecting is the only place it should be drawing the mask. See how I did that? It's doing, I'm brushing in these areas here. I let go for a minute, and then when I go back in, you can see where it's selected. And as I'm using it, if I press the Option key, it should make it a minus. But I might have to go in and erase use the Smart Erase and go in and remove where that is. So for example, it grabbed this shoulder area here of the building. I don't want it to have that. And so I just need to go in and make sure that I'm getting rid of areas that I don't want, because it did grab areas that it wanted to do. So for example, I didn't want to do in there. But if I go back to the other brush and add back in, just make this smaller and just make sure that I'm only grabbing those blue areas. So now it's pretty much grabbed everything I wanted. I'm going to go ahead and fine tune another area out. Let's get this all undone. Be careful not to go up too high on this. I always fine tune this later after the fact. That's the great thing about this. When you are doing these, you can go in and at any point you want to remove something, you can go back and do it always after the fact later on. So I don't have to be that finite as I'm showing you guys what I'm doing here. All right, so I got that down. Now I'm going to go ahead with that adjustment layer there. I can go ahead and decide to feather or other things in terms of like the appearance of the mask. But now that I've got the mask adjusted, I can go ahead and darken the sky by just pulling down the exposure a little bit. And that's looking kind of normal, so you can do that. Also, if I don't like the actual color of the blue, I could use the Kelvin slider and change the color temperature of the sky a little bit. I could warm up the sky, or I could cool it down even more to make it a little bit more blue than what it actually was when it was shot. Or I could go in and use those color sliders we were talking about earlier. So we have a lot of capabilities here as you're working with the shot. So like I said, pull down the exposure. It's looking pretty strong. And there we go. We've got a good image that, you know. And if I go here and click the before and after, you guys can see like this is what it looked like before I processed it, and this is where I got it to. A major change. So the idea here when you're processing your images is to go in and make sure that you're making them look photographic, not illustrative. And so that's how to use the basic adjustments in processing inside of Capture One.